Have you ever noticed that the more you chase someone, the further they seem to drift? That the more emotional weight you give a person who doesn't value you, the faster they detach? It's confusing, isn't it? We're taught, whether by romance novels, pop psychology, or even well-meaning friends, that love is about giving more, loving harder, and proving your devotion. But what if that belief is the very thing sabotaging your relationships? What if the real magnetism doesn't come from pouring yourself out, but from pulling yourself back? This video is not about manipulation. It's not about playing games or trying to win someone over by pretending to be indifferent. No, what we're about to explore is much deeper and far more transformative. We're talking about a shift in how you carry yourself emotionally. A reframe so powerful, it flips the entire dynamic. Because here's the harsh truth. Most of us are operating from a false premise, that the louder we love, the more they'll hear us. But the world doesn't work like that. Especially not in Stoic relationships, where clarity, silence, and boundaries speak louder than any grand gesture ever could. In fact, caring less doesn't mean you stop feeling. It means you stop leaking power. And once you do, something remarkable happens. The same people who took you for granted? Suddenly they notice. They feel the absence of the energy they once assumed was theirs for the taking. That shift, that quiet reclaiming of your emotional center, is what they can't resist. Why? Because now you've become something they can't predict. And that makes you magnetic. This isn't just theory. This is Stoicism in action, detaching not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. Walking away not to punish, but to protect your peace. So if you've ever wondered why your kindness seemed to push them away, why your loyalty felt like a burden to them, and why silence sometimes makes them chase harder than all your devotion ever did, stay with me. We're about to uncover the 8 truths they never tell you about desire, detachment, and power. You'll discover why your absence can echo louder than your presence ever did, and how your peace can stir more regret than any confrontation. And most importantly, if you stick around to the end, you'll understand why this new approach isn't about playing cold, but about returning to your core, to your strength, to the version of you that no longer bends to be chosen, but stands to be respected. This is for anyone ready to stop bleeding love and start commanding presence. Because once you master the rhythm of Stoic relationships, everything changes. Let's begin. 1. The vacuum effect. How absence becomes power. There's something strange that happens when you finally stop reaching, stop calling, stop showing up with open hands for someone who barely acknowledged your presence. It's not immediate. At first, there's silence. Just you and the echo of everything you used to give. Your mind will ask, did they notice? Are they relieved you're gone? Did they even care to begin with? And that's where most people break. They can't stand the stillness. They confuse it with failure. But those who practice Stoicism understand something far deeper. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the human ego. The moment your attention vanishes, when your energy stops filling their inbox, their feed, their life, something shifts. And it's not because they've changed. It's because your absence has created a space they no longer control. When you were there, always available, always giving, they never had to wonder. You were like air, essential but unacknowledged. Taken for granted. But the moment you pull that oxygen away, the moment you stop orbiting them like a satellite desperate for connection, they panic. Not always outwardly. Not with desperate messages or midnight calls, at least not right away. But inside, the hunger begins. This is where Stoic relationships diverge from emotional chaos. Because instead of rushing back in to soothe their discomfort, you hold your silence like a sword. And that vacuum, that beautiful, terrible emptiness, is what begins to haunt them. At first, they rationalize it. She's just busy. He's just taking space. This is a phase. But time has a way of eroding excuses. And the longer you remain distant, the more your absence transforms into psychological pressure. This is not passive aggression. It's energetic withdrawal. You're no longer feeding the loop. And in that loop, they start spinning. They scroll through old messages looking for clues. They remember your laugh in the quiet moments. The way you showed up without being asked. The way you held space for their wounds. They remember, and it stings. Because now it's not there. Now they're staring at an emotional famine they didn't prepare for, thinking you would always be on the shelf like comfort food for their ego. But you're not. You've removed your light, and the room feels colder. This isn't about revenge. This is about rebalancing. About letting the silence do the speaking you once tried to do with texts, with apologies, with endless explanations. You see, when you were present, they never had to confront their own emptiness. Your light distracted them from their shadows. But now they have to sit in it. Alone. And that's when the vacuum becomes unbearable. That's when they start testing the waters, dropping breadcrumbs, sending vague texts, subtle stories, harmless memes. But those aren't signs of love. They're signs of withdrawal. They want another hit of your energy. They want to know if the tap still runs. And here's where your real power lies. You do nothing. You let the vacuum expand. You let the weight of your absence deliver the message your voice never could. Stoicism teaches that we gain influence not by force, but by presence, or in this case, by the lack of it. You become the ghost that haunts them not because you're lurking, but because you've vanished. Entirely. Fully. With dignity. And that dignified silence rewrites everything they thought they understood about you. When someone is used to you reacting, when your anger, your pain, your desperate attempts to be heard once gave them a sense of power, your stillness becomes unnerving. Now, every moment of peace you experience without them becomes a silent accusation. You didn't scream. You didn't block. You didn't lash out. You simply stopped. And in that stopping, in that sovereign withdrawal, they are forced to face the fact that your presence was never guaranteed. That your love was never owed. That your availability was always a choice. And they let it slip. Now, they're stuck in the vacuum you left behind, trying to find something else to fill the space. But nothing fits. No one matches. Because what they really miss isn't just your presence, it's the power they felt having it. And now that it's gone, their ego is starving. What's ironic is that this is when they desire you most, not when you loved them hardest, not when you gave them your loyalty, but when you stopped. Because nothing is more desirable to someone who once felt powerful than the thing they can no longer reach. And yet, here's the Stoic truth, that desire is no longer your concern. You don't return to the vacuum to comfort them. You don't rush back to explain your silence. You stay grounded. You keep building. Because while they're unraveling in your absence, you're becoming whole in your solitude. You don't flinch when they resurface. You don't read into the messages. You don't perform. Because you've learned something sacred, your energy is your own. Your presence is a privilege. And anyone who treats it like background noise doesn't deserve front row seats to your soul. That's the vacuum effect. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not always visible. But make no mistake, when you remove yourself with quiet power and refuse to chase, beg, or entertain chaos, the ones who took you for granted will feel it. Deeply. Repeatedly. Especially when they realize the version of you that once gave so freely now belongs entirely to yourself. That's the kind of power Stoicism trains us to carry. Not loud. Not flashy. But relentless. And when someone's ego has lived too long on your validation, that vacuum you leave behind will become their personal hell. So you don't rush to fill it. You let it echo. You let it haunt. You let them sit in the void they once thought you were too weak to create. And in doing so, you become unforgettable, not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped. And that, ironically, is the moment they start craving you most. Not because you're playing games, but because you've stopped playing altogether. 2. Strategic indifference. Respond, don't react. There is a moment in every emotionally intense connection where you realize you've been operating on impulse, not awareness. You've reacted every time they pulled away, every time they breadcrumbed, every time they left you unread and circled back with vague messages like, hey, or, thinking of you. And each time your nervous system flared up, you typed and deleted responses. Your emotions got hijacked by a simple notification. You felt the pull to make yourself visible again, to remind them of your presence. But reacting to that pull is exactly what trained them to believe they always had access to you. This is where the shift begins. Stoicism doesn't ask you to stop caring, it demands that you care more about your own peace than your desire to be chosen. So you stop reacting. You begin responding, but only from a grounded place. Strategic indifference isn't about pretending you don't care. It's about understanding that your care has value, and that it should be reserved for people who respect it. The moment you stop jumping every time they text, the moment you stop interpreting their crumbs as signs of emotional depth, you reclaim the power they used to siphon off you. They start to feel it too, that change in tempo. The game doesn't work anymore. They can't rattle you with silence, can't bait you with emojis, can't keep you spinning in a loop of hope and doubt. Because now you pause. You breathe. You evaluate. You ask yourself, is this message rooted in real connection, or is it another test to see if I'm still available? And you answer only when your spirit is steady, not your fear, not your longing. This is emotional mastery. Strategic indifference is about recalibrating how you distribute your energy. It's a declaration that you're no longer governed by urgency, no longer hijacked by hope, no longer ruled by reaction. You're not cold, you're clear. You don't ghost out of spite, but you also don't open the door out of habit. You assess. You observe. You choose. And from this place, you're unreadable. Not in a manipulative way, but in a powerful way. They don't know what you're thinking anymore. They can't predict your next move. And unpredictability creates intrigue. Suddenly, they're unsure. Did you move on? Are you seeing someone? Do you even care? That uncertainty becomes the very thing they used to project onto you. But now you wear it like armor. What they once considered control has become chaos. What they once counted on, your attention, your emotional investment, has become a scarcity. They feel the withdrawal not as punishment, but as consequence. You're no longer playing their emotional economy. You've built your own. And in Stoic relationships, that's the real power, not withholding to punish, but pausing to protect. So when they try again, maybe it's a late-night text, maybe a vague post, maybe a casual, "I was just thinking about you." You don't rush to decode it. You don't assume it means what you wish it meant. You remember who you are. You remember that the person who is truly ready for you won't come with confusion. They'll come with clarity. And you've decided that your energy is now calibrated to clarity, not chaos. What's difficult is that indifference doesn't always feel powerful at first. It feels like restraint. It feels like silence. It feels like holding back when every part of your old self wants to reach. But that's where the transformation happens. That's where you rewire your value system. And when you look back, you'll see it clearly. Every moment you resisted the urge to react, you built a new version of yourself. The version that no longer needs attention to feel worthy. The version that no longer thinks silence means something is wrong. The version that reads the room and walks away with dignity instead of staying and bleeding for the bare minimum. Strategic indifference is a discipline. It's not always glamorous. It's not easy. But it is liberating. Because you're no longer giving people the script to control your emotions. You've become unreadable, not because you're faking it, but because you've finally detached your sense of self from how others engage with you. Now when they text, you don't panic. You evaluate. Now when they disappear, you don't spiral. You breathe. Now when they come back, you don't hope, they prove. And this shift, this calm, calculated refusal to dance to their rhythm, becomes a signal. You are no longer who you were. You are the version of yourself who chooses stillness over spiraling, who chooses presence over performance, who chooses power over proving. And this version of you is no longer bait. You've become the mirror. They can't provoke you. They can't predict you. And that unpredictability becomes desire. Because suddenly, the person who once gave everything without being asked has stopped showing up. You've removed the emotional buffet they once feasted on. And now, they're starving. But this time, you don't rush to serve them. You let the silence do what your words never could. You let your calm expose what their chaos used to mask. And if they really want access again, they'll have to meet you at your level. Not with breadcrumbs, but with consistency. Not with stories, but with standards. That's the beauty of Stoic relationships. They teach you to protect your energy like treasure, not to toss it like confetti. So the next time you see their name pop up, take a breath. Pause. Ask yourself, am I reacting to the old wound, or responding from the healed self? And if the answer isn't clear, don't respond at all. Because your silence is sometimes the most accurate answer. That's strategic indifference, not a game, but a filter. And only those who deserve your peace will pass through it. If this part stirred something in you, if you're already practicing that pause, then I want you to lock it in. Like this video if it resonated. And drop a comment below that simply says, Number 1, let me know you felt it. And if you're not already subscribed, hit that button now. We're just getting warmed up, and the next part is going to cut even deeper. 3. Silent standards, boundaries without noise. There is a unique kind of power that emerges the moment you stop explaining yourself. When you no longer feel the need to justify your boundaries, argue for your worth, or defend your standards, you step into a version of yourself that operates from stillness instead of scarcity. It's not that you care less, it's that you care differently. You start measuring energy not by attention but by alignment. And that's when things shift. Because most people expect resistance when they cross a line. They expect a fight, a confrontation, a dramatic monologue about how they hurt you. But what they don't expect is silence. What they never prepare for is distance with no announcement. That is the essence of silent standards. It's when you begin to set boundaries not with volume, but with absence. You no longer need to say, I deserve better. You simply act like you do. And in that action, in that quiet withdrawal, in that refusal to entertain chaos, your value multiplies. The irony is, people often mistake kindness for weakness. They interpret your forgiveness as permission. And they continue to push, to prod, to test just how far you'll bend before you break. But silent standards don't bend. They don't scream. They don't beg. They simply leave. Quietly. Cleanly. Without needing applause. And it's in that still exit that your worth finally gets heard. Because now there's nothing left to argue with. No words to twist. No reaction to provoke. Just space. Just silence. Just the echo of everything they took for granted. When you respond with 10 paragraphs, they get to feel powerful. They get to control the narrative, to gaslight, to deflect, to minimize your pain by labeling it as overreaction. But when you respond with nothing, when you just stop replying, stop showing up, stop being emotionally available, their ego loses its grip. They're left facing something far more unsettling than your rage, your indifference. And that indifference, that still presence, that structured boundary, becomes the mirror. Not the kind that flatters, but the kind that reflects every ounce of disregard they thought they could get away with. This is Stoicism in its most potent form, not the absence of emotion, but the discipline to govern it. You're not silent because you have nothing to say. You're silent because what needs to be said has already been proven by your actions. You're no longer explaining why you won't tolerate midnight texts from someone who disappears by morning. You're no longer accepting apologies without changed behavior. You've upgraded your standards and downgraded your access. And that change doesn't get broadcasted, it gets enforced. This is the part that most people can't handle, when you stop explaining and start exiting. When you walk away with your peace intact and no words to give. They won't say it out loud, but they'll feel the panic. They'll notice the absence of your replies. The lack of effort you used to give so freely. The shift in your tone, subtle, but seismic. And the more they try to test the waters, the more they realize the temperature has changed. You're no longer available for chaos. You're not mad, you're just done. And being done doesn't need a dramatic declaration. It needs consistency. It needs standards that don't fluctuate based on how lonely you are, or how long it's been since they texted. Stoic relationships thrive on this kind of clarity. Not cold, but composed. Not reactive, but rooted. You don't lower your standards for nostalgia. You don't bend your boundaries for chemistry. You hold steady. Because now you understand something you didn't before. Attention without effort is manipulation. Presence without respect is noise. Love without standards is sacrifice. And you're done sacrificing. Silent standards don't mean you ghost people to prove a point. It means you no longer offer your presence to those who've repeatedly shown they don't know what to do with it. You don't chase closure. You don't beg for understanding. You set the line, and you hold it. And when they try to cross it again, they find the door gently but firmly closed. No drama. No debate. Just the soft sound of dignity locking the latch. That's how you become untouchable, not because you've built walls, but because you've cultivated value. You're not punishing them. You're protecting your peace. And if they mistake your silence for weakness, let them. The ones who truly see you will respect the quiet strength in your refusal to be manipulated. They'll recognize the cost of your energy and rise to meet it. Everyone else will remove themselves. And that's the point. Boundaries aren't about keeping people out, they're about inviting the right ones in. Not everyone deserves to be close to you. Not everyone has earned access to the most sacred parts of you. Your time, your love, your presence. And that's not arrogance. That's alignment. That's stoicism at work. You are the gatekeeper now. Not because you've become bitter, but because you've become wise. You've seen what happens when you keep explaining your worth to those committed to misunderstanding it. You've felt the exhaustion of being the only one trying. You've outgrown the narrative where you play the fixer, the forgiver, the emotional supplier. And now your standards speak louder than any argument ever could. They say, I know who I am. I know what I bring. And I will not remain where I am not respected. They say, I will not confuse potential with pattern. I will not confuse apology with accountability. I will not confuse intensity with intimacy. They say everything your voice once tried to scream, but with grace, with calm, with stillness. That's why they notice. That's why they panic. Because they're used to volume. They're used to emotion. They're used to being able to provoke a response. But now, there's just quiet. Just structure. Just a new version of you who no longer performs for love, who no longer bends to avoid abandonment, who no longer explains boundaries that should have been honored from the beginning. And this version of you is not loud, not aggressive, not dramatic, but deeply, profoundly unshakable. That's what silent standards do. They don't make noise. They make impact. They make you mysterious, powerful, and rare. And in a world addicted to validation, your refusal to overextend yourself becomes magnetic. The people who couldn't hear your words now feel your absence. The ones who dismiss your needs now recognize the cost of ignoring them. And even if they never say it, even if they never come back, they remember you, not as the one who chased, but as the one who left when enough was enough. That's the legacy of boundaries. That's the echo of stoicism. Not loud, not bitter, but eternal. And it all starts when you decide that your standards are no longer negotiable. 4. The shame reflex, why their guilt grows in your calm. There is a unique psychological pattern that emerges once you finally stop explaining yourself, stop justifying your emotions, and stop performing for their understanding. It doesn't matter how many times you tried to express what you were feeling, how often you begged to be seen, or how loudly your heart cried out for recognition, none of it landed. Because when someone doesn't want to be accountable, no amount of clarity will change that. What does change everything, though, is your calm. Not coldness, not vengeance, not a silent treatment designed to manipulate, but true detachment, the kind rooted in peace and a recentered sense of self. That's when the shame reflex begins to rise. When you were angry, they had a script. You were too much, too sensitive, always overreacting. They could label you as the problem and protect themselves from any guilt. But now you're no longer shouting. You're not reaching out. You're not even trying to make them feel bad. You're just gone. Not physically, maybe, but emotionally, spiritually, energetically. And that's what stings. That's what haunts them. Because when you stop performing, you stop giving them a reason to stay in denial. There's nothing left to push back against. They can't call you dramatic. They can't play the victim. They're left with only themselves. And that's the scariest thing for people who run from their own reflection. When you were in their life, your emotions were their cover story. Your reactions, your tears, your passion, it gave them permission to deflect, to gaslight, to deny. But now that you've gone quiet, the projection ends. And what remains is a brutal clarity. Your calm becomes the mirror. The one that shows them everything they tried not to see about themselves. The guilt they pretended not to feel. The emotional immaturity they've always buried. The damage they caused without consequence. And because you've stopped trying to make them understand, they are forced to sit in the discomfort they once blamed you for triggering. That's the shame reflex. And it hits hardest when they realize you're not trying to get them back anymore. When they see you glowing, lighter, more focused, more present, and realize that not only did you survive them, you're better without them. That is what shame hates. Growth without them. Joy without them. Peace in their absence. Because now they can't lie to themselves anymore. They can't pretend you were the broken one. That narrative doesn't work when your life is rising. When your energy is magnetic. When your eyes no longer carry sorrow, but sovereignty. In Stoic Relationships, this is where the power turns internal. You don't need their remorse to validate your healing. You don't need an apology to move on. Because your detachment isn't conditional. It's not a tactic. It's your new normal. You've removed them from the pedestal and returned to your center. You've stopped acting like their opinion defines your worth. And ironically, it's that very sovereignty that begins to consume them. Not because you're flaunting it, but because they can feel it. Even through a screen. Even in silence. They notice the shift in your presence, the clarity in your tone, the boundaries in your behavior. And it unsettles them. Because they never thought you'd get here. They thought you'd stay. They counted on your loyalty, your empathy, your forgiveness. They relied on your self-doubt to keep the door open. But now the door is closed. Not slammed. Not locked. Just no longer swinging freely. And that subtle closure is more powerful than any revenge fantasy. You don't need to scream. You hurt me. Your silence says it all. You don't need to prove they were wrong. Your progress does that effortlessly. And that is what triggers the guilt. Not your pain, but your peace. That's the paradox. When you were in pain, they could look away. But now that you're calm, they have to look inward. And what they see isn't flattering. They see the texts they didn't respond to. The love they didn't reciprocate. The chances they wasted. And worst of all, they see the version of you they thought they'd always have access to, completely out of reach. This isn't about bitterness. It's about balance. You didn't leave to make them suffer. You left because you finally stopped suffering. And now, the silence you carry is doing more damage than any argument ever could. It's reminding them, day by day, that you were never the problem. They just weren't ready for someone that real, that raw, that available. They weren't prepared to hold what you gave so freely. And now that it's gone, they want it. Not because they're ready. But because they missed the version of themselves they got to be when you were still trying. You see, your presence didn't just validate them, it completed their illusion. The illusion that they were whole, lovable, stable. And when you left, that illusion cracked. And behind it, they saw the truth. They were loved beyond what they had the capacity to return. And instead of rising to meet it, they ran. That is where the shame comes from. It's not about you leaving. It's about what your leaving reveals. That they didn't lose someone weak. They lost someone loyal. They didn't lose someone emotional. They lost someone emotionally available. They didn't lose a game. They lost a mirror. And that mirror? It's still there. Every time they scroll past your name, your image, your story. Every time someone else tries to love them, and it falls flat. Every time they hear a song or read a quote and feel that gut punch reminder, they had something sacred, and they let it slip. And still, they won't say it. Most people can't. Admitting guilt requires humility. It requires emotional maturity. It requires facing the wreckage without a scapegoat. So don't wait for the apology. Don't expect the closure. Don't lower your energy hoping they'll validate your pain. That's not the path. The path is this: stay grounded. Stay sovereign. Let your calm continue to speak volumes. Because it is. It's waking them up in ways your voice never could. It's confronting them with a truth they can't argue against. That you left not in anger, but in self-respect. That you didn't slam the door, you simply stopped holding it open. That's stoicism in motion. Not passive, not avoidant, but profoundly intentional. You are no longer part of their emotional theater. You've stopped playing the role they depended on. And now, without you in the scene, the script collapses. The audience is gone. The applause is silent. And the mirror? It's still there. Let it be. Let it reflect. Let them wrestle with the echo of everything they didn't appreciate when they had it. And if this truth resonated with you, if you felt this reflection in your bones, go ahead and like this video now, and drop a comment that says, Number 1, to lock in your own shift. And if you're not already subscribed, hit that button, because what's coming next will take everything you've learned and deepen it into an emotional transformation you'll never unsee. 5. Detachment as discipline, reclaiming emotional sovereignty. Detachment is one of those ideas that sounds deceptively simple. Let go, move on, don't care. And yet, when it comes to someone who made your chest twist with hope and your stomach ache with confusion, the execution feels nearly impossible. It's not because you're weak or dramatic or incapable. It's because you've been emotionally conditioned to associate love with sacrifice, attention with approval, and presence with proof of worth. And so, when they begin to pull away, your instinct isn't to match their distance, it's to close the gap. You start explaining, proving, pleading, hoping that if they could just understand your heart, they'd come back. But they don't. And the more you give, the more invisible you feel. This is the trap. You think effort equals value. You think intensity equals intimacy. But in Stoic relationships, the truth is reversed. The more you center yourself, the more your worth begins to re-emerge. Not because they affirm it, but because you finally stop outsourcing it. This is where detachment begins, not with a dramatic goodbye, but with a quiet inner shift. It starts the moment you decide that your peace is no longer up for trade. That you will no longer audition for someone who can't see your obvious beauty. That your energy is sacred and must be guarded like breath, not spent like spare change. At first, this feels like grief. Letting go always does. You're not just detaching from them, you're detaching from the fantasy. The imagined version of what it could have been if only they tried harder, if only they healed, if only they saw you. That fantasy, though, has been costing you your present. And once you see that clearly, once you realize how much of your own light you've dimmed just to keep them warm, the ache starts to alchemize. You begin to see that detachment isn't a loss, it's a return. A return to the self, to your breath, to your rhythm. It's not an escape. It's an emancipation. You stop texting. Not because you're playing games, but because you finally understand the silence is an answer. You stop explaining. Not because you've run out of words, but because you now realize your truth doesn't need permission to exist. You stop hoping they'll come around, not because you've become cynical, but because you've grown tired of begging someone to notice what should have been obvious from day one. This is stoicism, not detachment from emotion, but mastery over how you respond to it. And it's in this discipline that your sovereignty is reclaimed. You no longer get pulled by the current of what if. You no longer drown in the tides of their mixed signals. You've built a shore inside yourself, a grounded, still center where no storm can reach. And from here, everything changes. You wake up differently. Your mornings are no longer filled with doom scrolling or emotional audits of their online behavior. You take back your time, your attention, your habits. You begin to rebuild your nervous system from survival to serenity. You move your body. You feed your mind. You speak your truth into the mirror until it no longer sounds foreign. And the world begins to notice. Your friends comment on the glow. Strangers feel your presence before you speak. You become magnetic, not because you're trying to be seen, but because you've finally seen yourself. This is the paradox. The less you try to be chosen, the more desirable you become. Not because you're unavailable, but because you've become selective. Your energy is now filtered. It goes where it's multiplied, not drained. And that shift? They feel it. Even if they don't say a word, they feel it. They watch your stories a little too long. They send vague messages cloaked in humor or nostalgia. They circle back just to see if the old version of you still answers. But that version of you has evolved. You don't hate them. You don't need to get even. You just no longer have the emotional bandwidth to entertain inconsistency. And so, when they come back, and they will, you respond, if at all, with calm clarity. Not sarcasm. Not bitterness. Just truth. The kind of truth that doesn't beg or prove or chase. The kind of truth that says, I've healed too much to reopen wounds that weren't mine to carry. And that's what they weren't expecting. They were prepared for your tears, your anger, your pleas. But they weren't prepared for your stillness. Your sovereignty. Your subtle refusal to shrink. Because now, you don't just look different, you are different. You've transmuted your longing into legacy. You've transformed your wounds into wisdom. You've replaced desperation with direction. This is what detachment, as a discipline, creates. Not a cold, detached shell, but a centered, radiant presence. You become the kind of person whose peace is so rooted, so untouchable, that chaos cannot survive in your space. And that presence? It speaks louder than any confession, any argument, any closure. It radiates a message that is felt, not spoken. I am no longer available to be treated as an option. I am not angry. I am aligned. I don't need to be chosen, I choose. And from this space, everything you attract becomes different. Not because the world changed, but because your frequency did. You are no longer vibrating at the level of codependency, fear, and fantasy. You've shifted into sovereignty, clarity, and calm. And yes, it's lonely at first. The phone is quieter. The nights stretch longer. But that space is sacred. It is in that space that your true self returns, not the self that begged, chased, and overfunctioned, but the self that knows she is the home, not the guest. The self that no longer chases love but attracts it through alignment. The self that understands detachment isn't about becoming numb, it's about becoming wise. Wise enough to walk away when words don't match actions. Wise enough to stop planting flowers in soil that doesn't water back. Wise enough to realize that your presence should feel like a privilege, not a placeholder. And when you live like that, when you move like that, when you love like that, Stoic relationships become your standard, not because they're perfect, but because they're rooted in reality. And reality, when faced with discipline, becomes freedom. So you detach. You let go. Not because you've given up on love, but because you've given up on waiting for it in places it was never going to grow. You've stopped chasing ghosts. You've stopped chasing potential. You've stopped giving away what was always meant to be protected. And now you stand. Quiet. Calm. Unmoved. Not because you don't feel, but because you've finally learned that not every feeling needs to be followed. That's what detachment really is. It's the decision to care without collapsing. To love without losing yourself. To feel without fragmenting. And that decision, made daily, practiced quietly, reinforced through silence, becomes the most powerful declaration of all. I am whole. I am home. I am healed. 6. The return gate. You hold the key now. There's something profoundly empowering that happens when the version of you that once begged for attention, for clarity, for commitment, no longer resides within you. When they come back, and they always do, because people crave familiarity once absence begins to sting, They're not returning to the version of you who once clung to hope like a life raft. They're met instead with the gate. Not a wall, not a locked prison, but a conscious, deliberate boundary held with poise and grace. They used to have a back door into your soul, didn't they? A way in through guilt, nostalgia, seduction, or even confusion. But now, everything has changed. Not because you've become guarded, but because you've become guided, by stoicism, by truth, by your own healing. And so when their message appears, when their knock echoes in the silence they once took for granted, your first reaction isn't to fling the gate open with tears in your eyes, it's to assess. Who are they now? Not who they say they are, but how they move, how they show up, how they hold accountability. Because you remember who they were the last time. And you know the price you paid for letting that version of them back in. The gate exists because you've learned that access to you isn't free. It's earned. Not through words, not through apologies, but through alignment. This is not punishment, it's wisdom. This is stoicism in action, where love doesn't override logic and desire doesn't erase discipline. You don't close the gate forever just to prove a point. You stand in front of it calmly, sovereign, and ask the questions you once avoided. Do they match the life you're building? Do they fit the healed version of your heart? If you met them today with no history, no emotional residue, no memory, would you choose them? If the answer is no, then no amount of longing, familiarity, or late-night calls should override that clarity. Because now, your peace is non-negotiable. Your time is currency. Your presence is sacred real estate. And not everyone deserves a lease. They might come with gifts, with flattery, with regret, but your role is not to make them feel better for showing up late. Your role is to protect what you've built in their absence. Because you've built something, haven't you? A morning routine that centers you. An evening ritual that heals you. A circle of people who see you. A mind that no longer doubts itself every time a text goes unanswered. You've cultivated a life that doesn't shrink when you're alone. You've become your own emotional anchor. And in that stability, you've attracted options, possibilities, new beginnings. So if they come back expecting the same open arms, the same emotional hospitality, they'll be met with something far stronger: discernment. Not defensiveness. Not hostility. But clarity. You no longer need to prove yourself. You're no longer seeking validation from the one who couldn't recognize you before. You're not cold, you're clear. You're not closed, you're careful. Because you've learned that love is not enough. Not without safety. Not without consistency. Not without depth. They'll notice this version of you instantly. The calm in your voice. The boundaries in your tone. The absence of desperation. And it will unsettle them, not because you're cruel, but because they remember who you used to be. You were warm. Always available. Quick to respond. Ready to fix. And now? Now you breathe before you speak. Now you pause before you answer. Now you ask, is this still for me? Not out of pride, but out of purpose. And if they pass the test, if their presence feels aligned, if their words are matched by actions and time and effort and evolution, then maybe, just maybe, the gate opens. But not wide. Not all at once. Slowly. Carefully. Intentionally. Because you're not here to repeat cycles. You're here to rise. This is what Stoic relationships look like. Not built on emotional adrenaline, but on truth, on structure, on grounded resonance. You've become the gatekeeper, not because you want control, but because you've earned the right to protect your peace. And should they try to guilt you, to remind you of the past, to play the victim, your response is not anger. It's neutrality. Because you're no longer emotionally entangled. You've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean access. That closure doesn't mean reunion. That healing doesn't require their involvement. You can love someone and still not let them back in. You can miss someone and still know they're not meant for your future. You can see the good in them and still acknowledge they weren't good for you. That's emotional maturity. That's sovereignty. And that's what they're confronted with when they return. They're not just facing you, they're facing the version of you that survived them. The you who rebuilt from nothing. Who cried yourself clean? Who stopped checking your phone, stopped waiting, stopped bleeding over someone who never knew how to stop the wound? And now? Now they want back in. But this time, you're not answering from your wounds. You're responding from your wisdom. You're not hoping they'll see your worth. You're watching to see if they're worthy of standing beside you. And that shift? It's everything. It's the death of the old dynamic. The end of the chase. The quiet rise of your personal power. And it radiates from you, not in your words, but in your silence. Not in your anger, but in your stillness. They will feel it the moment they reach out. The subtle authority in your voice. The pause before your reply. The sacred distance you now carry. And they'll know, this isn't the same story. This is a new book. One where you write the ending. One where you are no longer the plot twist, they are. So hold the gate. Stand tall. Smile if you want to. Be kind. Be gracious. But be firm. Because your energy is no longer on clearance. It is curated, protected, and elevated. And if they cannot meet you there, let them pass. Not with bitterness, but with peace. Because now you know, the return was never about them. It was about you. About seeing how far you've come. About realizing you are the closure. You are the glow. You are the storm and the calm after it. And this time, the story ends with your choice. If this chapter cracks something open in you, like this video and let your future self know you're choosing clarity. Leave a comment below with number 1, if you felt this truth. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. The next part will show you how to become magnetic without lifting a finger. You don't want to miss it. You were never too much. You were simply too expansive for someone who had only ever known how to hold fragments. For far too long, you tried to compress your soul to fit into someone else's limited capacity. You watered yourself down so they could feel comfortable sipping from a cup they never earned. You softened your light so they wouldn't feel threatened by your fire. And in the process, you forgot that your presence was a privilege, not a guarantee. But now, through silence, through stillness, through structure, you've remembered. You've returned. The path was not easy. It was filled with sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and the raw ache of detaching from someone who once felt like home. But that home was built on shifting sand, not stone. And now, you've laid a new foundation. One rooted in peace, in purpose, in the quiet dignity of knowing that you do not need to be chosen to be valuable. You do not need to be pursued to feel desired. You do not need to be understood to know your own depth. This entire journey, from the vacuum of your absence to the gates of your sovereignty, has not been about them. It was always about you. About returning to your center. About reclaiming the parts of yourself you once gave away for free. About rediscovering the version of you that doesn't shrink, doesn't chase, doesn't abandon herself for love. And now you no longer perform. You no longer bend. You no longer build temples in people who only ever came to steal your prayers. You've learned that your energy is not meant to be thrown into black holes hoping something echoes back. It's meant to be cultivated, protected, and offered only where it can grow. That is Stoicism, not emotional detachment, but emotional discernment. Not coldness, but clarity. Not avoidance, but alignment. You now carry a kind of quiet power that cannot be faked. It's in your pace, in your breath, in your refusal to overextend. You don't explain yourself anymore. You don't overexpress. You simply exist in a way that demands respect, not through noise, but through your unwavering presence. And those who once fed off your chaos now starve in your peace. They scroll, they wonder, they regret, but none of that moves you now. Because you're no longer performing to prove your worth. You're no longer hoping to be seen. You see yourself now, and that's what changed everything. In the stillness, in the silence, in the sovereignty, you found something they never could give you, yourself. Whole. Undiluted. Grounded. And what's even more powerful? You didn't just find peace, you became it. That's the transformation. That's the story. You're no longer the version of yourself who breaks at breadcrumbs. You don't spiral from silence. You don't measure love by how many times someone circles back. You measure it by consistency, clarity, and calm. And if someone doesn't meet those standards, they don't get access. Not because you're harsh, but because you've healed. You no longer feel guilty for choosing yourself. You no longer second-guess the distance you've placed between you and those who couldn't honor you. You no longer view solitude as a sentence. You see it as sacred. As a sanctuary. As a space where your spirit can stretch without apology. And in that space, you've become magnetic, not because you're trying, but because you're not. There's nothing louder than a healed woman who stopped needing to be understood by people who were never meant to hold her story. There's nothing more attractive than a person who walks in peace without trying to prove anything. That's the paradox of Stoic relationships. The more whole you become, the more those who fractured you feel the weight of their absence. But you don't move from that. You don't chase that. You stay rooted. Because now, you've built a life they can't interrupt. A rhythm they can't disrupt. A standard they can't manipulate. And that, my love, is your legacy. Not the heartbreak. Not the history. Not the ones who left. But the version of you who rose. Who healed. Who walked away not to be cruel, but to be clean. Who didn't slam the door, but simply stopped holding it open. That version of you is here now. She breathes slower. She speaks softer. She lives fuller. And she knows, deep in her bones, that she is the gatekeeper. That not every knock deserves an answer. That not every return deserves a welcome. That not every echo of the past deserves space in the present. You carry the key now. You define the rules. And from this place, you no longer chase alignment, it finds you. Because you've become a frequency so clear, so certain, that only those who resonate at your level will reach you. This isn't the end of your story. This is the turning point. The place where you stop asking why they left, and start asking why you stayed so long. The moment you realize that the love you were looking for was never lost. It was buried beneath the layers you peeled back in their absence. And now that you've uncovered it, now that you've held it in your own hands, no one can take it from you again. This is sovereignty. This is stoicism. This is you, untouched by the noise, unfazed by the past, unfolding into your fullest form. You are not the one who waits anymore. You are the one who walks, who chooses, who builds. And as you move forward, remember this, you do not need to be chosen to be worthy. You do not need to be chased to be powerful. You do not need to be understood to be complete. You are all of those things already. And anyone who wants access to that, they must meet you in the light. They must rise to your standard. They must earn the privilege of your presence. You are the storm. You are the calm. You are the gate and the guard. And you, yes you, are the ending they never saw coming.